What's up, YouTube? This is Let's Discuss MMA, and today I'm going to be doing another tier list video. In this video specifically, we're going to be talking about which combat sports can best transition into modern day MMA, mixed martial arts as we call it. And so, personally, I have some experience in some of the sports that we're going to be going over today. I think they could provide some experience that I could provide some experience with, and personal things that I feel like that pros and cons. And for someone who's been training MMA for a little bit over 2 years now, what each sport has given me, and this is some of it's gonna be personal experience and some of the things that I've seen in professional setting. And so by no means am I personally a professional. This is just someone that's transitioned from these sports to MMA now. And so that's just a little bit of feedback that I wanted to give. So we're gonna be getting into the video now. So first things first, every video that I do on combat sports is out of respect for every combat sports in general, every martial arts in general. This is not to bash or disrespect any art. This is just purely for entertainment and also what I believe is the best foundation and that could give you the best transitional base to MMA. So let's get started. So first things first, on the blind ranking list, it's gonna be Taekwondo. So I'm going to put this at a D tier. I think I've done Taekwondo for over 10, 15 years. And personally, it's one of my favorite sports to do. To watch as point fighting, I'm not a big fan of. I'm not a big fan of that point style fighting. But in terms of doing it, I thought it was really, really fun. I've learned a lot from it. I learned a lot of good footwork from it. I learned distance management from it. I learned how to kick, especially the flashy kicks, whether it be back kicks, spinning hook kicks, spinning back kicks, all those things, axe kicks. I think it's a beautiful sport to do. As a hobby, as far as I'm concerned, for most people, I think it's great. But the reason why I rank it so low is because I think it has so much potential to get higher on this list, maybe a C tier or maybe a B tier, even if I'm being really, really honest. But I think the problem with Taekwondo is the lack of, well, one, the lack of defense when it comes to someone punching you in the face, right? Like the hands down style that we see in Taekwondo is not going to transition well into MMA when someone's literally trying to punch you in the face. And so when that happens, the defense lacks. There's only so much you can do while trying to fight on the back foot, even on in Taekwondo. I mean, you could definitely land some shots, but as far as like transitioning purely with Taekwondo into MMA would be very, very hard. And so I think it's interesting because Taekwondo has a lot of room for improvement. Maybe if we take away a little the more of the, take away the point style, fighting style, and more of the hard aggressive style we saw back in the 90s at Taekwondo, I think we could have evolutionized the game. But just focusing on so much of the sport aspect, I think it's taken a lot away from what Taekwondo really is. And so obviously the lack of leg kicks, the lack of even head kicks, right? You're not really throwing 100% in head kicks in Taekwondo, and just not getting able to get hit really, really hard is going to be a problem, right? And so that's why I think Taekwondo is very low on this list. Next is going to be Aikido. I think I think everyone knows the answer to this. I think it's no impact on MMA. I think it's a beautiful art. I think it's fun to watch when Aikido guys do demonstrations. That's not without to say that I'm sure they have self defense that does work in maybe a real life scenario. But if we're talking about MMA, where there are rules, there's a rule set to it, and we're coming in strictly off using Aikido guy to come into MMA, the transition from that to modern day MMA is going to be very, very difficult. In my personal experience, I haven't seen any Aikido guy in the MMA scene, even in amateurs, that come from an Aikido background and just start demolishing people. And so that's just what I've seen personally. So I feel like until someone comes to me and proves to me or show, and I see it on the professional scene or even on an amateur scene where an Aikido guy can, wreak havoc, I think it's going to be really, really hard to put Aikido any higher. Combat Sambo. So this one's easily S tier. Basically, the purest, I think, out of all the other sports comparatively, because it's basically MMA. I mean, it's literally modern day MMA before modern day MMA. Because combat sambo has obviously been around for longer. It's also been Russia's national combat sport, if I believe. And so, just looking at that, some of the guys I'm just gonna name is Habib Nurmagomedov, Islam Makhachev, two guys at the highest level at UFC lightweight. that have transitioned from combat sambo background to MMA and have, we've seen it, like they are the most dominant fighters in the world today. And so the reason why combat sambo is so ranked high and why it's easy to transition from combat sambo into MMA is because it's basically you're utilizing your strikes to set up takedowns and utilizing your takedowns to set up a striking sequence, right? And a grappling sequence. And there's also like leg locks. They do arm bars. They have a submission. They have a very minimal submission game compared to jujitsu. But at the very basic level, I think it's good enough to transition to MMA very, very easily. So they have the striking, they have the wrestling, and they have the very limited submissions. And so those are the three things in MMA. And so that's why it would be a lot easier. But the only thing is they don't have too many combat studios in the States. And even if they do, I don't know how high quality they are. But definitely, if you were to take on one of these foundations, definitely Sambo's S tier for sure. Okay, Judo. So I'm a little bit tossed up on Judo, but I'm going to put it at C for now. And the reason why I put it at C is because I think high level Judo really works. I think high level Judo we've seen in MMA and combat sports work at the highest level. If you guys know or familiar with Karo Parisian was a welterweight back in the day, and he's a very good example of what high level judo is and what you can do at the highest level. Obviously, another name that comes to mind is Ronda Rousey. Literally, although women's MMA wasn't as developed, I mean, she literally steamrolled everybody with just pure judo. She like really didn't have any boxing technique or any type of striking arsenal in her game, but she literally, basically used her judo to win a world title and hold it for a pretty long time. And so I think judo at a high level is very, very good. It's also good to transition over to MMA because there are techniques that, as long as you're not only utilizing the grips like the sleeve grip or the collar grips, I think it could definitely transition way better than some of these sports on the bottom because at least you're grappling, right? And grappling is a really fundamentally important aspect in MMA. I think grappling is more important than striking, in my opinion. I think grappling is number one. And so any form of grappling is going to be very, very useful to transition into MMA, in my opinion. Therefore, judo, I mean, it could be higher, but because of the sleeve grips and people are obviously used to grabbing the sleeve or the collar, that's why it's only at C. Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. This one's going to be a B. And this is going to be maybe between the judo and jiu-jitsu guys where they believe that one sport is better than the other. I think both have its pros and cons. I think obviously in judo, the takedowns and the throws are way better. I mean, it's not even comparable. Whereas compared to in jiu-jitsu, like obviously as soon as you're on the ground, a lot of the bottom work that they do on whether it be half guard, full guard, side control. I mean, it literally doesn't matter any position on the ground, whether it be top mount. Even so, I think the level of ground game, right, just pure ground game, I think jiu-jitsu is unmatched. And if we see a lot of high level guys in the UFC that do jujitsu and that has a BJJ background, you don't see a lot of them get treated like anything on the ground, if that makes sense. Like these guys, like they get hurt. Like specifically, let's talk about Oliveira. Oliveira gets hurt in most of his fights, and when he does get hurt, right, what does he do? He falls to his back, and he's waiting for you. He's trying to make you play in his guard, right? Nobody jumps in his guard. Another famous example was Damian Maia. Every fight that Damian Maia was in, nobody wanted to go to ground with him. Ortega is another recent case. All these three guys have one thing in common is that their jiu-jitsu is absolutely high level. And therefore, when your jiu-jitsu is at that level, nobody wants to play in your guard. Nobody wants to be on the ground with you because they know what's going to happen. You're going to get choked out. You're going to get arm broken. You're going to get your leg twisted off. It honestly doesn't matter what it is, but they just don't want to be on the ground with these people. And so transitioning from jujitsu to MMA is very, very useful. You just have to pick up a little bit of striking technique. But I think if you're really good at jujitsu and you're competing at a high level, whether it be ADCC or even in no-gi grappling, no, I think no-gi grappling is more effective in my opinion than gi, but both are very, very good and therefore ranks on the B tier. And so the next one is going to be Shaolin Monk Kung Fu per se. I would say this one is going to be no impact on MMA. The reason why I say that is because I think it's a beautiful art, just like we talked about with Aikido earlier. But I personally think that there hasn't been any specific case where a Shaolin guy or a Kung Fu guy has come into the MMA scene and has provided a high level transition to MMA or a successful, for that matter, successful transition to MMA. And so I haven't never taken Kung Fu lessons. I don't really know what it's really like to take a class in Kung Fu, but just based on my personal perspective of what I've seen in MMA, I haven't seen Kung Fu being utilized in MMA too often, and so that's why I'm gonna rank it with no impact on MMA. Although there are guys that do like Wing Chun stuff and like Tony Ferguson. I think Song Yadong actually comes from a kung fu background as well, and so I just personally think there's not enough people, or in my opinion, it's even worth doing kung fu in order to, launch your transition into MMA. And so next one's gonna be sumo. Same thing with sumo. I think it's gonna be falling at the no impact on MMA. I think sumo is interesting. I actually enjoy watching sumo. It's actually really, really fun to watch, and I think it's interesting because a lot of these huge guys that are like over 300 pounds have really, really good footwork. They have very fast feet, and the amount of power they generate um, with how close they're standing to each other is absolutely amazing. I think you should take up sumo if you want to be an offensive lineman. I think this is perfect. I mean, the way their bodies form, right, is a perfect offensive lineman. The footwork, the fast feet, utilizing the hands to push, right? That's all offensive lineman drills. And so if you want to be an NFL offensive lineman, or even play for your high school lineman, or even college lineman, or whatever the case may be, right? I think sumo is perfect, honestly. But in terms of MMA, there obviously there's no striking. There's uh there's grappling. I think the grappling is beautiful to watch at times, and it takes an enormous amount of strength to throw someone that big that far at times. If you see some of the sumo matches, I apologize. But in terms of like striking, there is none, and so that's why it falls at the no impact on MMA. Wrestling. I know this is going to get a lot of hate. I'm putting wrestling at S. The reason why I put wrestling at S is I know all these other sports have been kind of saying like, oh, well, one's missing the other. Like, Taekwondo's missing the punches and no grappling, or same with judo. Judo has a grappling, but it has no striking. And jujitsu is all about the ground. And you know, the reason why I put wrestling so high, basically near combat sambo, is if you can wrestle really, really well, right, even at a collegiate level D1, then your chances of transitioning to MMA and you being successful is extremely high. There's so many cases like that. Literally, there's probably 9 or 8 out of 10 cases where literally, if you're a wrestler and you, especially D1, and you come into the MMA scene, there's no way that you're not decent. It's literally, I mean, again, this is a statistic I'm making up, but from what I've seen, if you're a wrestler, right, if you're especially a D1 wrestler and you transition to MMA, it's very, very easy in my opinion. And for some reason, I don't know if it's because wrestlers generate so much power in their hips, but they they happen to have really good overhands, a lot of them. And so I think if you develop your striking game just a little bit more, I think wrestling is perfect. It teaches you everything as far as being an MMA fighter physically and mentally. I think the biggest part about the physical is that wrestling, literally, the grind does not stop. Like the amount of hard work you're putting in, not just in a wrestling match, but during practice every single day. And I've wrestled for about 2 years in high school. But honestly, the amount of blood, sweat, and tears you're putting into every practice session, even to just make weight, is incredible discipline. It builds a lot of willpower. The determination and the mindset of most wrestlers just mentally is absolutely insane. And then, like I said, physically, that's how you physically get fit, because they're pushing themselves every day. And so we've seen cases where you can have very minimal striking and become world champion. A very famous case is Ben Askren. We obviously think we can all agree that his striking is not the highest level, but with that level of striking, the man was 19-0. He was undefeated for not a small organization, for Bellator at the time, which is amazing. And so that goes to show how dominant even just having one base, or one foundational base such as wrestling, could be. And that's why it's ranked so high, even though you can't strike in wrestling. And so I'm going to be putting it S tier. Next is going to be boxing. I'm going to be put boxing at B right now. And the reason why I put boxing at B is because it's only because of one thing. And that's kind of why I'm putting these sports at the bottom as well, is because if you have never taken a leg kick in your life, you don't know what it feels like to take a leg kick. And so I know we're gonna go back to like, well, neither has a wrestler, but again, I'm talking about if a wrestler gets leg kicked, right, enough times, they're gonna shoot a double. They're gonna shoot a single. It's gonna be open. But in boxing, there you can only hope for an overhand. And what happens when you try to throw overhand and you're putting all your weight, or you're trying to throw a jab and you're putting all your weight on either the front or back foot and you're getting leg kicked, it's not gonna feel good. And so I think in terms of how well you can transition with boxing, I think it's very, 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 very good. I think it's at the top of the list. It could even fall A, but I think B for right now, just because of lack of kicks. And we'll get into the other disciplines and why I put boxing at B. But in terms of striking, it's almost perfect. It is almost perfect. Um, you know how to throw 1-2 better than anybody on this entire list. You know how to throw a perfect combination with your hands perfectly. You know how to slip shots. You know how to roll shots. Anything that involves your hands, right? If it's punching, you are the master of it. And so I want to rate boxing very highly. And I think this is actually a very, very good sport to transition to MMA. Okay, next is gonna be kickboxing. So I'm going to be putting this at A tier. And I've actually changed my mind recently on kickboxing, is because I've seen kickboxers where they don't do as well in MMA because they lack either the grappling, obviously, or they lack the hand speed, whereas boxers have a lot of hand speed, or better defense and better head movements. Whereas like kickboxing is kind of in the middle. It's just basically like, in my opinion, rudimentary handwork. And then you have like kicks here and there, but it's kind of like a mixture of like kicking sports with like taekwondo or karate or like Muay Thai. But I think the reason why rank it so high is we've seen recently what kickboxing champion can do, with no MMA or very little MMA experience, right, in a very short amount of time. And I think that goes to show that it obviously depends on who's doing the sport. But Alex Pereira is a very good example. He obviously possesses extremely powerful hands, which most people don't have. But that doesn't mean that his skill set is lacking as well. Um, Obviously, Israel Adesanya is another case. Former kickboxing world glory champion, came into MMA and literally style bended like he does on everybody. And so that's another case. There's another guy in smaller organizations that's doing pretty well. He's personally one of my favorite glory kickboxers, Cedric Doumbé. Sorry if I mispronounced his name, but he's a very good kickboxer, and he's transitioning very, very well into MMA. So with a little bit of wrestling, work, I think these guys transition better because they know how to throw kicks, right? Their striking arsenal is more complete than a boxer who's only utilizing their hands. They're going to be using kicks, they're going to be using punches, they're going to mix it up with kicks and punches, and so that's why I'm gonna be putting kickboxing at A tier. Next thing be Muay Thai. Muay Thai could fall into here, but I'm going to be putting it at A. And the reason why I say A is because, again, in my opinion, grappling triumphs strikers. Grapplers triumph strikers in 95% cases. Again, this is my own statistic, but from what I've seen, I think most of the time, grapplers do dominate a lot of times. I know there's an era where there was an era of strikers dominating, especially in the UFC. But again, we're seeing the transition from strikers into grapplers once again. And so, looking at that, I think Muay Thai is definitely deserving of a S tier spot, but A for now. But I'll tell you why it's literally it's like A plus plus. And the reason for it is it's almost complete. It literally has everything in striking. You can throw elbows, you can throw knees, you can throw obviously punches, you can throw kicks. They have the best leg kicks in the game. That's where everyone gets their leg kicks from. And also they implement some like throws and sweeps into their game. And so it's almost there. Obviously the lacking part is their grappling, but Muay Thai is probably one of the best stand-up uh, combat sports you can take up to transition to MMA. We've seen a lot of successful people in the MMA scene take up Muay Thai and transition over. A lot of guys actually, especially nowadays in the amateur scene, they do a lot of Muay Thai and then they get into MMA later on if they develop their ground game while they're. And so Muay Thai definitely A tier. Easily could be S tier as well. We're gonna keep it at A. So Chukundo, this is a weird one. JKD. which was created by Bruce Lee. I haven't seen enough of it. This is my opinion. And so because I haven't seen enough of it, I think it's hard to kind of rank it on this system. The only person I can think of that maybe had a JKD background was maybe like Alex Sikaris in the UFC. But other than him, I mean, I don't really know anybody that has used JKD in MMA, and whether that be amateur or pro. So I think it's just not has been utilized enough, and I just don't see the effectability of it in MMA right now. But again, Bruce Lee is a genius, and so he basically his philosophy was taking out all the unnecessary stuff that doesn't work in some of the combat sports or some of the techniques in the combat sports, and then taking out the useful of techniques in these combat sports, right? So he took a little bit from Taekwondo, he took a little bit from Western boxing, he took a little bit away from jiu-jitsu, wrestling, you name it. And so, if you watched, I know it's in his movies, but if you watch some of his movies, his philosophy, you could see that he wasn't just trying to take what the traditional take, which is like, oh, one martial arts is better than the other, but basically that all martial arts can be viable if you take bits and pieces of it, which now we call MMA. And so Bruce Lee's a genius, ripped to a legend, RIP. But I just haven't seen JKD being used enough to kind of rank it. But for now, I'm going to be ranking it for no impact on MMA. And then last but not least is point style karate fighting. This one I'm going to have to say C. Could fall to D, but C. The reason why it's ranked higher than Taekwondo is that at least the point style fighting, they're allowed to use hands. I mean, it's not the hardest shots, but the point fighting style adds another form of fighting, right? It adds another layer of fighting because you can actually use your punches to score. Whereas Taekwondo, you're not allowed to attack the face. In ITF, you can, but again, if we're talking about just sports Taekwondo in general, like the WT style, you actually can't. And so I think point karate, all around, you can hit to the face very lightly, obviously, but with your punches, and obviously keeping the hands up compared to Taekwondo, where it's a little bit lower, is going to teach a lot more discipline to keep your hands up in an MMA fight. Same thing with Taekwondo. Is the reason why it's ranked so low, though, even though people have used it as their base, is because the lack of hard conditioning, the lack of grappling. I think you know as Mike Tyson once said, like, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. And a lot of the sports where you're not doing a lot of hard conditioning or hard sparring, it's really, really tough to transition into a sport where you're nonstop trying to get, either knocked out or submitted. And so it's not to say that the level of intensity is not the same. I think some athletes are different than others. And so, if we compare, but I'm just specifically comparing, like, if you're doing a hobby Taekwondo guy compared to a hobby boxing guy, or like a hobby Taekwondo or hobby karate guy versus a hobby Muay Thai guy, like, the level of intensity is actually a lot more different, in my opinion. I think at the professional level, everyone trains really, really hard and very, very hard. But I think the level of training at a hobby level is very different. What's up, guys? This is Let's Discuss MMA. If you've come to the end of my video, I just want to always thank you guys for the support. I'll continue to make these videos. I know the quality, again, I'm trying to blast out as much content as I can. So I'm going to continue. If we can get the subscriber count up, that would be wonderful. And I thank you guys for even tuning in and watching my video. So thanks again.